The oldest recipe we have found, written on clay, nearly 4,000 years old, is not for bread. It is a hymn to a goddess, and it is a set of brewing instructions, the same text, a prayer you could follow in a kitchen. That is how important this was. Now go further back. Past writing, past cities, past farming, 13,000 years. A cave in the hills above the Mediterranean. Stone mortars cut into the floor, and residue inside them. Starch grains, damaged in a very specific way. The way grain is damaged when it is malted, soaked, sprouted, heated, mashed, by people who did not farm, who had no fields, no pottery, no villages, and no bread, which raises a question that has been argued about for 70 years. We all know the story. Humans learned to farm. Farming gave us grain. Grain gave us bread. And somewhere along the way, someone left the porridge out too long and invented beer by accident. A happy mistake, a footnote. What if it is backwards? What if the beer came first? What if people started collecting wild grain in enormous quantities, doing weeks of miserable work, not to eat it, but to ferment it? And that if you want to know why we settled down, why we planted fields, why we built the first monuments, why we stopped walking, the answer is not in the bread. It is in the jar. Before we can argue about which came first, we need to be clear about what beer actually is, because the definition does real work. And the first thing to understand is that humans did not invent fermentation. Fermentation was here long before us. Yeasts are single-celled fungi, and they are effectively everywhere. On fruit skins, on grain, in soil, drifting through the air. They are on your hands right now. They are in the room you are sitting in. And what they do is simple. They eat sugar and produce alcohol and carbon dioxide as waste. That is the whole process. It is not a technique. It is something that happens whether anyone wants it or not. Leave sweet liquid exposed to the air in a warm place, and it will ferment by itself, reliably, without any help. Which means alcohol is not a human invention at all. Alcohol is a natural feature of any environment with sugar in it. Fruit falls from trees, splits, and begins fermenting on the ground within days. Animals eat it. Many of them clearly seek it out, and some show visible effects afterwards. Our ancestors would have encountered fermenting fruit constantly, for millions of years before anyone made anything. There is even an argument that our lineage adapted to it, developing an enzyme better at processing alcohol. The suggestion is that this happened around the time our ancestors began spending more time on the ground, eating fallen fruit. It is debated and not settled, but the underlying point stands regardless of the genetics. Alcohol was available to be discovered rather than invented, and the discovery was inevitable. So making wine, in the loosest sense, is almost trivially easy. Crush fruit. Wait, that is it. Grapes even carry the necessary yeast on their own skins, so you do not need to add anything at all. Honey is the same. Dilute it with water, and it will ferment on its own into mead. Which is why fermented drinks from fruit and honey are almost certainly older than beer, and probably much older. But beer is a different problem entirely, and this is the crucial distinction in the whole story. Because grain contains almost no sugar. Grain contains starch, and yeast cannot eat starch. It is the wrong molecule, and yeast has no way to break it apart. A seed does not store its energy as sugar for a very good reason. Sugar dissolves in water, attracts every organism nearby, and would be gone in a season. Starch is stable, insoluble, and compact. It is sugar packed away for long-term storage, which is exactly why grain keeps for years, and exactly why it cannot simply be left out to ferment. Leave wet grain in a pot, and you do not get beer. You get mold and rot. So beer requires an additional step that wine and mead do not, and it is not an obvious one. Somebody has to convert the starch into sugar first, before the yeast can do anything with it, which raises a genuine question. How would anyone work that out without any concept of chemistry? The answer is that the seed already knows how, and it does it every spring on its own. A seed is a package of stored food and a dormant plant, waiting for the right conditions. When it gets wet and warm, it begins to sprout, and it needs energy to do that. It cannot photosynthesize yet. It has no leaves, so it has to use its own reserves. And to use them, it releases enzymes that break its stored starch down into sugar. The seed converts its own starch into fuel, automatically, as part of germinating, which is precisely the step a brewer needs, performed by the grain itself, for free. So the technique is to start the seed sprouting, Then stop it before it uses the sugar up. You soak the grain in water until it begins to germinate and let it go for a few days. Then you dry it with heat, which kills the sprout and leaves the sugars and enzymes intact. That is malting, and it is the single most important step in the history of beer. Now the grain is sweet, storable, and ready. Crush it, mix it with warm water, and the enzymes finish the job. You are left with a sugary liquid, and at that point nature takes over again. Wild yeast arrives from the air, from the grain, from the vessel, from the hands of whoever is working. Within a day or two it is bubbling, and within a few days it is beer. No yeast needs to be added, because nobody knew yeast existed for almost the entire history of brewing. People simply knew that certain vessels worked better than others, and reused them, which was, without anyone understanding why, a way of keeping a good yeast population alive across batches. Now, having laid out those steps, notice something important about them as a sequence. Soak, sprout, dry, crush, mash, wait. That is 6 deliberate stages over roughly a week. Every one of them has to be done in the right order, and several require judgment about timing. Sprout too little, and there is not enough sugar. Sprout too long, and the seed eats it. This is not something you stumble into by leaving porridge on a windowsill, which is the strongest objection to the accident story, and it is worth taking seriously. The accidental version usually goes like this. Someone made grain porridge. It got wet. It sat too long. It fermented slightly, tasted odd, and made them feel unusual, and they did it again on purpose. That is plausible as a first encounter, and something like it probably did happen many times. But a barely fermented porridge is not beer. It is weak, sour, and unreliable. Getting from there to a repeatable drink means discovering malting, which is genuinely counterintuitive. You have to deliberately wet your precious grain, which is the one thing that normally destroys it. Everything anyone knows about storing grain says keep it dry, keep it cool, keep it sealed. Malting requires doing the opposite on purpose, and then trusting that it will be worth it. So somebody, at some point, had a reason to try this repeatedly until it worked. And that reason is what the entire argument in this video is really about. One more thing before we go looking for evidence, because it changes what we are searching for. Ancient beer was not what you are picturing. Set aside anything clear, cold, or carbonated. It was thick, cloudy, and full of suspended grain, closer to a thin porridge than a drink. It was often drunk through straws, to get beneath the layer of husks floating on top. Sumerian art shows people sharing a large jar, each with their own long straw reaching into it, which is a detail worth holding on to, because it tells you this was never a solitary activity. Now let's go looking for the earliest traces, and it's worth understanding why this is difficult. Beer does not survive. It is a liquid, and it was drunk. There is nothing left to find, so archaeologists cannot look for beer. They have to look for the marks that brewing leaves behind. And there are 3 kinds, each of which tells you something different. The first is chemical residue absorbed into pottery, where the vessels soaked up traces of what it held. Certain compounds are strongly associated with fermentation, and some survive for thousands of years in porous clay. The second is microscopic starch granules, which are surprisingly durable and change shape depending on what was done to them. A starch grain that has been ground looks different from one that has been heated, and different again from one that has been malted. Germination physically eats channels into the granule, leaving a distinctive pitted structure that specialists can recognize. The third kind of evidence is equipment. Vessels of particular shapes and sizes, and installations built for processing. With those 3 tools, we can go looking. And the oldest strong candidate is in Israel, a site called Rekhfet Cave, in the hills near the Mediterranean coast, used by people known as the Natufians. The Natufians matter enormously in this story because of where they sit in the sequence. They were not farmers. They did not plant crops or keep herds in any developed sense, but they were not fully mobile either. They built substantial structures and stayed in places for long periods. They harvested wild cereals intensively, using sickles in a landscape rich enough to support them. They are, in a sense, the people caught exactly at the transition right before farming begins. And Rekhfet Cave was a burial place. People were interred there, sometimes with flowers laid beneath them. Cut into the stone floor of that cave are mortars, some of them deep, carved into the bedrock itself. Researchers examined residues from these mortars and found starch granules with damage consistent with malting. sprouting, heating, and mashing, in a pattern that is difficult to explain any other way. The dating puts this at around 13,000 years ago, well before agriculture. If the interpretation holds, this is beer brewed by people who did not farm, in a place where they buried their dead. And that context is not incidental. It may be the most important part of the find. This was not everyday food production in a domestic setting. This was happening at a site of ritual significance, which fits a pattern that appears repeatedly in the ancient world, wherever fermented drinks show up. Beer and ceremony arrive together, and they stay together for thousands of years afterwards. Now, the honest caveat. Residue analysis is difficult, and not every specialist accepts every claim of this kind. Contamination is a genuine risk, and starch damage can sometimes have other explanations. This particular finding has been broadly received as strong, but it is one site and one team's interpretation. So hold it as a serious candidate rather than as a settled fact, and let's look at what else there is. Because the pattern gets more convincing when the same thing appears somewhere completely unconnected. Move to China, to a site called Jiahu in the Yellow River Valley, around 9,000 years old. Chemical analysis of pottery from Jiahu found residues consistent with a fermented drink, and the recipe appears to have been mixed. Rice, honey, and fruit fermented together. Not beer in the strict sense, but the same underlying practice, invented independently on the other side of the world. Which tells us something significant. Fermented drinks are not one invention that spread from a single origin. They emerge separately, wherever people have starch, sugar, and containers, because the conditions produce them. Now the third site, and this is the one that turns a curiosity into a serious argument about human history. Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, roughly 11,500 years old. Enormous carved stone pillars, some standing several meters tall, arranged in circular enclosures, covered in relief carvings of animals. Foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, birds, rendered with real skill. Cutting, moving, and raising those pillars required a large number of people working together for extended periods. And it was built by people who, as far as we can tell, were not yet farming. That single fact overturned an assumption that had stood for a very long time. The old model said agriculture came first, producing surplus, which produced settlement, which eventually produced monuments. Göbekli Tepe reverses the order. The monument appears before the farming, not after it, which forces an obvious practical question that has nothing to do with religion. How do you feed hundreds of people gathered in one place, doing heavy labor for weeks at a time? They are not producing food while they work. Somebody has to supply it, and in quantity. And here is the detail that connects this site to everything else in this video. Excavations found large stone vessels, some with capacities of over 100 liters. Residue analysis of some of these vessels indicated the presence of oxalate, a compound that forms during the brewing process. The evidence is contested, and other explanations have been proposed for how those residues formed. But the possibility on the table is extraordinary, and it is worth stating clearly that one of the earliest monumental sites in the world had brewing vessels built into it, and that gatherings there may have involved feasting on a substantial scale, which would mean beer was not a product of settled civilization. It was present at the beginning of it. Now step back and look at what these three sites have in common, because the pattern is consistent. All three predate or coincide with the very earliest farming, rather than following it. All three involve people processing grain or starch intensively without the agriculture that supposedly justifies it. And in at least two of them, the context is ceremonial rather than domestic, which is exactly what you would expect if fermented drink was a driver of these developments rather than a byproduct. But it is also what you would expect if beer was simply one of several things people did at important places. Correlation is not causation, and this is precisely where the real argument begins. Because a claim has been sitting in the background of this field for over 70 years. It was first proposed in the 1950s, treated as eccentric for decades, and has returned with new evidence behind it. The claim is that the domestication of cereals was driven by the desire for beer rather than for bread. It is one of the most provocative ideas in the study of human origins, and it may be wrong. But the argument for it is considerably stronger than most people assume, and it deserves a fair hearing. The case begins with a question that sounds simple and turns out not to be. Why would anyone start farming? We treat agriculture as obviously good, an upgrade, the moment humanity got serious. The evidence does not support that. Skeletons from early farming populations are frequently shorter than those of the foragers who preceded them. They show more dental disease, more signs of nutritional stress, and more evidence of repetitive physical strain. Diets narrowed dramatically. A forager ate dozens of plant species. A farmer ate mostly one, with everything riding on it, and the labor is relentless. Clearing, planting, weeding, guarding, harvesting, processing, storing, all on a schedule that never pauses. So the puzzle is not why farming spread. Once it exists, it supports more people, and more people win. The puzzle is why anyone took the first steps, before any of those advantages had appeared. Because the early stages of cultivation are pure cost. More work, worse food, and no visible payoff yet. Something has to be worth that. And bread, the argument goes, is not obviously worth it. Wild grain is genuinely miserable to process, and this is easy to underestimate from a distance. The seeds are small, tightly wrapped in husks, and attached to a stalk that shatters when ripe, which means the plant scatters its seed on the ground the moment you touch it, by design. So harvesting means catching it at exactly the right moment, or gathering seed from the dirt. Then threshing, winnowing, and grinding, all by hand, for hours, to produce a modest amount of flour. And what you get at the end, without ovens or leavening, is a flat, dense, gritty bread. Nutritious, certainly. Storable, certainly. But a great deal of work for something fairly joyless. Meanwhile, there were nuts, fruits, roots, fish, and game available with considerably less effort in many of these landscapes. So the question sharpens. Why put that much labor into the one food that requires the most work per calorie? Now consider what beer offers that bread does not, and the list is longer than it first appears. Start with the obvious one. It contains alcohol, and alcohol changes how people feel. That is not a trivial motivation. Human beings have consistently paid enormous costs for substances that alter mood. But the argument does not rest on intoxication alone, and the stronger points are elsewhere. Second, fermentation improves the food. It breaks down some compounds that make grain hard to digest. It can increase the availability of certain nutrients, and it produces B vitamins as a byproduct. Ancient beer was thick with suspended grain, so drinking it was closer to eating than to drinking. Third, it is safer than water in a settled community, though this point needs care. The brewing process involves heating, and the resulting acidity and alcohol both discourage harmful organisms. This mattered less for mobile groups near clean streams and more once people clustered around fixed water sources. Fourth, and this is underrated, fermentation is a form of storage. A fermented liquid resists spoiling in ways that porridge does not, buying time in a world without refrigeration. Fifth, and this is where the argument becomes genuinely interesting, beer is inherently social. You cannot brew a single serving. The process only works at volume and produces far more than one person can drink. And once it is ready, it does not keep indefinitely. It has to be consumed within a limited window, which means every batch of beer is a deadline that requires a crowd. Brewing structurally forces people to gather at a scheduled time in a specific place. No other food does this. Bread can be stored and eaten alone, slowly, by anyone. Beer arrives with a built-in social obligation attached to it, every single time. And that turns out to matter enormously if you are trying to build something like Göbekli Tepe. Because the hardest problem in early monument building is not engineering. It is attendance. How do you persuade hundreds of unrelated people to travel and work and cooperate for weeks? You cannot pay them. There is no money, no state, no army, and no authority to compel anyone. What you can do is hold a feast. And a feast is enormously more effective if there is drink involved. Alcohol lowers the friction between strangers, which is precisely the problem such a gathering has to solve. So the argument runs like this, and notice that it does not depend on anyone being drunk. Groups begin gathering at particular places for ceremony, burial, exchange, and finding partners. Feasting is central to these gatherings, because sharing food is how unrelated groups build trust. Somebody works out that fermented grain makes the gathering better and more memorable and easier. The gatherings grow, and the demand for grain at those specific times and places grows with them. Wild stands cannot supply it reliably, because they ripen when they ripen and fail in bad years. So people begin encouraging the grain, clearing competitors, scattering seed near the site, returning to check on it. None of that is farming yet. It is management, and it requires no decision to change how anyone lives. But it selects, quietly, for plants that hold on to their seed instead of scattering it, because those are the ones you actually manage to harvest, and therefore the ones whose seed you replant. Repeat that for a few centuries, and the plant is domesticated, without anyone ever intending to domesticate it. And by then people are tied to the fields, and to the site, and the whole trajectory is set. That is the beer before bread hypothesis, and it is coherent, and it fits several awkward facts. Now let's hear the objections, because they are serious and they come from serious people. The first is straightforward. There is no direct proof that beer motivated cultivation, only that both existed early. Early sites show many things happening at once, and picking one as the cause is interpretation, not evidence. The second objection is about proportion. Even where brewing occurred, it may have been a small part of grain use. People were clearly making bread and porridge from cereals as well, in what looks like far greater quantity. The third objection is that the same intensive processing serves both purposes equally well. Grinding, storing, and harvesting grain is required whether the end product is a loaf or a jar. So the effort does not, by itself, tell you which product motivated it. The fourth is that some evidence for very early bread also exists from sites in the same broad period. Charred remains of bread-like material have been found predating agriculture, which complicates any clean sequence. And the fifth objection is the deepest. The question may be badly posed from the start, because the distinction between beer and bread is far blurrier in practice than the debate assumes. And once you understand how ancient beer was actually made, that distinction almost stops existing. One widely discussed method of ancient brewing starts with something that looks exactly like bread. You make a loaf from malted grain, deliberately underbaked, so the inside stays soft and the enzymes survive. Then you crumble that loaf into water and let the mixture sit, and it ferments into beer. The bread is not a food in that process. The bread is a storage format for brewing material. It is portable, it keeps, it can be transported and traded, and it becomes beer whenever you want it to. Whether this was the standard method in ancient Egypt is debated, and the picture has grown more complicated. But it demonstrates the important point regardless of how common it was. Bread and beer are not two separate inventions. They are two outcomes of the same set of steps. Both start with grain. Both require crushing it. Both involve water and heat somewhere in the sequence. The difference is a matter of moisture, timing, and temperature, and small changes flip you between them. So asking which came first may be like asking whether the left shoe was invented before the right. They probably emerged together, out of the same experiments, in the same places, done by the same people. And the sharpest version of the question is not which came first, but which one justified the effort. Which one made people willing to do weeks of miserable work for a plant that fights back? My honest answer is that we do not know, and anyone claiming certainty is overreaching in either direction. But we do know something about how these societies valued beer once they could write about it. And what they wrote makes the modern assumption that beer is a luxury look badly mistaken. Because in the first cities we can read, beer is not entertainment. Beer is infrastructure. Mesopotamian administrative tablets record beer being distributed to workers as part of their compensation, not as a treat or a reward, as a ration, calculated per person, per day, and recorded by scribes. Different amounts were allocated to different ranks, which tells you it functioned as a measure of status. The same pattern appears in Egypt, where workers on major state projects received beer and bread as standard provision. These are two of the earliest complex states we can document, and both of them ran partly on beer. Now, why would a state do that instead of simply handing out grain? Partly because beer was food. Thick with suspended grain, it delivered real calories rather than just alcohol. Partly because it was safer to drink than water in a dense settlement, which mattered every single day. Partly because processed rations are harder to hoard, resell, or divert than raw grain is. And partly, one suspects, because people worked better when the day ended with something to look forward to. So the earliest bureaucracies in the world were, among other things, breweries with accountants attached. And this is where writing itself enters the story, in a way that is easy to miss. Early writing systems are dominated by administrative records rather than literature or history. Quantities received. Quantities issued. Who was owed what? The paperwork of moving goods around. Beer appears constantly in these records, with its own signs and its own units of measurement, which means one of the things writing was invented to do was keep track of beer. And then there is the text we opened this video with, which is a different kind of document entirely. A Sumerian hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess associated with brewing, written down around 4,000 years ago. It praises the goddess, and as it does so, it walks through the stages of making beer in order, handling the grain, working with the malt, mixing, straining, and the vessel's filling. It is simultaneously a religious text and a technical procedure, and it was almost certainly sung, which is a genuinely elegant solution to a problem every pre-literate craft has to solve. Most people could not read. Instructions had to survive in memory, accurately, across generations. So you set the process to a melody, attach it to a god, and repeat it as a devotional act. The recipe is preserved because forgetting it would be forgetting a prayer rather than losing a note. And notice what that tells you about how beer was regarded in that world. Nobody writes a hymn to a minor indulgence. Gods attached to things a society considers fundamental. There are deities associated with grain, with rivers, with weather, with fertility, with death. Beer sits in that category, alongside the forces a farming society depended on for survival. And it appears in the literature as a marker of civilization itself, which is more striking still. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the wild man Enkidu lives among animals, eats grass, and drinks from water holes. His transformation into a human being involves being taught to eat bread and to drink beer, after which, the text says, he becomes cheerful, washes himself, and is ready to enter human society. Beer is not incidental in that passage. Beer is one of the things that makes a person, which is a remarkable status for a beverage, and it did not come from nowhere. It reflects thousands of years in which brewing and gathering and belonging were tangled together. And that tangle explains something about drinking that persists into the present day. Because look at how alcohol is actually used across almost every society that has it. Weddings, funerals, harvests, contracts, welcomes, departures, victories, reconciliations. It marks transitions, and it accompanies moments when a group needs to act like a group. Drinking alone is often regarded with suspicion, in many cultures, as a sign that something is wrong. The same substance is normal in company and worrying in isolation, which is a strange fact if it is merely a drug. But it makes complete sense if the drink was always primarily a social technology. Now, a necessary caveat, and I want to be direct about it rather than bury it. Nothing in this video is an argument that alcohol is good for you, because it plainly is not. The health costs are real and well documented, and the harm caused by dependence is enormous. Explaining why something became central to human societies is not the same as recommending it. The point is narrower. This substance was woven into how people lived long before anyone weighed the costs. And that history is why it remains so difficult to separate from ordinary social life. So we can return, finally, to the question we open with, and give it the fairest answer available. Did beer come first, or did bread? And I think the honest answer reframes the question rather than choosing a side. The evidence does not show a moment when someone chose beer over bread, and it probably never will. What it shows is people doing an enormous amount of work with grain earlier than we expected, for reasons that are not obvious. And it shows that work concentrated at places where people gathered, buried their dead, and built things together. Which suggests the real answer is not beer and not bread, but the gathering itself. People wanted to come together, in numbers, repeatedly, at fixed places and times. That desire is older than agriculture and older than any of the technologies we have discussed. And a gathering has requirements. It has to be fed. It has to be worth traveling for. It has to produce something that makes strangers feel like participants rather than rivals. Beer solves all three at once, which is exactly why it keeps appearing at these sites. So the causal chain may not run from grain to beer to settlement at all. It may run from gathering, to a need for feast food, to grain, to everything that followed from grain. Which would mean agriculture was not invented to feed people day to day. It was invented, in effect, to supply parties. And then it took over everything else. That framing sounds flippant, and I want to be careful, because it is not a joke. These gatherings were not entertainment. They were how unrelated groups made peace, traded, and found partners. They were where knowledge moved, where disputes were settled, and where alliances were formed. A feast was diplomacy and marriage market and insurance policy and religion all at once. In a world without states, courts, or writing, the shared meal was the institution that did all the work, and beer made that institution function better, which is not a small contribution to human history. Now hold that alongside something we established near the beginning of this video. Fermentation is not a human invention. It happens on its own, everywhere, without us. So what did humans actually invent? If the chemistry was already running by itself, we invented control. We took a process that occurs randomly and made it happen on purpose, on schedule. Malting is the key step, and it is genuinely counterintuitive because it means deliberately wetting your grain. Everything anyone knows about storing food says that is how you lose it. So somebody had to do the wrong thing repeatedly and pay attention to the result and refine it. That is not an accident. Accidents happen once. This was a practice developed and transmitted deliberately, and it was transmitted for thousands of years without writing, in songs, and in demonstration. Which brings us back to the hymn, and to why it is such a perfect artifact of this whole story. A goddess, a prayer, and a set of instructions in one text, with no separation between them. Because there was no separation. The technical and the sacred were the same activity. You did not brew beer and then thank a god for it. Brewing was the act of participating with her, and that fusion is itself the point. The knowledge survived because it was worth singing about. So look at what this ordinary thing actually is next time you encounter it. A drink older than farming, possibly older than the fields that supply it, made by hijacking a seed's own germination, using enzymes the plant produces for its own purposes, finished by organisms nobody could see and nobody knew existed for almost the entire history of the practice, paid to workers as wages in the first cities, recorded in the earliest bureaucracies, written into the first literature as one of the things that makes a wild man into a person, and possibly, though we cannot prove it, the reason anyone bothered to plant a field at all, which leaves one last thing worth carrying out of this, and it goes beyond beer. We tend to explain the past in terms of survival, as though people only ever did what was necessary. Food, shelter, safety, reproduction. Everything else treated as decoration added later, once there was spare time. But the evidence keeps refusing to cooperate with that model at site after site. The monuments come before the farming. The ceremony comes before the surplus. The feast comes before the field. People buried their dead with flowers before they had pottery, and carved stone animals before they had villages, which suggests that the things we call luxuries were not luxuries at all. Gathering, marking occasions, belonging to something larger than a family group. These were requirements, and a great deal of what we call practical progress may have been built in service of them, not because people were frivolous, because a species that survives by cooperation needs reasons to assemble. So the granary and the field and the village may all trace back to a problem that was social rather than nutritional. How do you get 100 people who owe each other nothing to show up and stay and work together? Nobody solved that with an argument. They solved it with a feast and something in a jar. And once you have solved it, everything else becomes possible, including everything that came afterwards, which is a strange origin for civilization and considerably more human than the one we usually tell. Not a species that grew serious about food and reluctantly built a society around it. A species that wanted to be together and rearranged the entire planet in order to manage it. So the next time you are handed a drink at a wedding, or a funeral, or the end of something difficult, notice that nobody had to explain why. Notice that everyone knew what to do. That gesture is not modern, and it is not cultural in any shallow sense. It is doing exactly what it was doing in a cave in the hills 13,000 years ago, marking that this moment is different and that the people in this room are together in it. The chemistry has not changed. Yeast eats sugar and produces alcohol, as it always did. What changed is that we learned to schedule it and then built our lives around the schedule. We did not invent fermentation. We invented the occasion. And then we invented farming and cities and writing and law, largely in order to keep having it, which is either the least dignified origin story imaginable or the most honest one. A species too social to stay apart, using a fungus it could not see to hold itself together. Everything else in recorded history is downstream of that. We did not settle down to eat. We settled down to drink together.